The Subcommittee on Government Operations and the Subcommittee on Healthcare Benefits and Administrative Rules will come to order, and without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. It is not every day that we get to hold hearings and highlight good news about federal regulations. Certainly in July, the administration announced in the course of just 5 months, the federal government was able to achieve a reduction in the net regulatory cost. Bravo. While still issuing new regulations, this administration actually has saved $22 million, and I would like to reiterate, 22 million American taxpayer dollars over this course. And to put that in abstract terms, at the end of the Obama administration, it would have taken someone 3 years and 177 days to read through the entire code of federal regulations. As of today, that number has been reduced to 2 years and 217 days. This amounts to an over 25% decrease in the size of the CFR. Now, this type of progress is shrinking the federal regulations is really unheard of, and it is thanks to the President's regulatory reform agenda. In January, President Trump issued an Executive Order 13771, which established a one-in, two-out process where agencies must repeal 2 regulations for every new regulation that the agency issues. The order also directed the agencies that they must achieve a net regulatory cost of 0 in the fiscal year 2017. By all accounts, the agencies will continue to surpass this goal. And in February, President Trump issued a second executive order that provided a process by which the agencies would implement the one-in, two-out requirement. The Executive Order 13777 requires each agency to designate a regulatory reform officer and to implement regulatory reforms at their agency, and to establish a regulatory reform task force to review the agency's regulations to determine whether they should be repealed or replaced. Now, in September, I joined leadership from this committee and the House Judiciary Committee to request briefings from 24 agencies on the work of their task force. The results from these briefings are indeed impressive. Most agencies have begun comprehensive reviews not only for their regulations, but guidance documents, policies, information collections, and other written materials that impose burdens on the public. Many agencies have already started to clean house by starting the process to repeal and amend regulations. And this kind of kick in the pants change our out-of-control federal regulatory footprint was badly needed. The committee will be hearing today from 3 of those agencies that enthusiastically embrace this effort and have developed a strong and effective task force. We look forward to you sharing some of your best practices with the committee today, and others seeking to do the same in their agencies. We will also hear from a panel of regulatory experts to understand how these changes have been seen in unprecedented levels of regulatory relief and what the process means for the future of the federal regulatory state. I look forward to working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisles to consider how we can support and improve upon this effort. I'd like to thank each of you for being here today as witnesses and for your valuable work on this particular area. We look forward to hearing from you and seeing where this work takes us. We are waiting on the ranking member at this particular point, and so what I would do is we will go ahead and actually swear in our witnesses if we could at this point. All right, so I would first like Ms. Joy Chung, the Director of Oversight and Compliance in the Office of Deputy Chief Management Officer at the Department of Defense. Welcome. Mr. Giancarlo Brizzi, is that right? Oh, man, I get an A for today. The Principal Deputy Associate Administrator at the Office of Government-Wide Policy at the General Services Administration. And the easiest name out there, Dr. James Owens, the Acting General Counsel at the Department of Transportation. Pursuant to committee rules, we ask that all witnesses be sworn in before they testify. So if you would please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? All right, thank you. Please be seated and let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. In order to allow time for discussion, we would ask that your oral testimony please be limited to 5 minutes, but your entire written statement will be made part of the record. And as a reminder, there's kind of a clock in front of you there, and so if it comes out with a big hammer, that means stop. And we also, it will remind you there's a red button, so if you'll press that so that we can hear you and we can take the notes accordingly. So, Ms. Chung, we will recognize you for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Meadows, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Connolly, Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, and members of the subcommittees. Thank you for this opportunity to provide information about the Department of Defense's Regulatory Reform Task Force and DoD's regulatory reform efforts under Executive Orders 1377 and 13771. My name is Ju Chung, and I'm the Director of Oversight and Compliance in the Office of the Deputy Chief Management Officer at the Department of Defense. With our regulatory reform efforts, the Department is committed to more faithfully adhering to the regulatory principles that federal agencies should promulgate only those regulations that are required or necessary and that do not unduly burden the American people. On April 20th, 2017, the Department of Defense established a regulatory reform task force, and I was designated its regulatory reform officer. The task force was established to conduct a comprehensive retrospective review of all of its 716 existing codified regulations, including 350 Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement clauses and provisions, to make recommendations to the Secretary on whether they should be repealed, replaced, or modified in accordance with law. The DoD task force is composed of senior leaders, and there are 3 subgroups that have been established under the task force to aid in the review of the Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation clauses and provisions, the regulations under the Army Corps of Engineers, and the regulations under the Defense Health Agency TRICARE rules. The task force's efforts can be divided into 3 phases. First, the establishment. Second, the review and recommendations of the rules by the task force. And third, the implementation and sustainment of the reform efforts. In order to review all 716 codified regulations at a steady and actionable rate, the task force established a bi-weekly schedule of review with the goal of concluding its review by the end of 2018. At the outset, the task force established schedule of reviews by topic in order to evaluate regulations for consolidation and to eliminate unnecessary, outdated, or ineffective rules, which is a priority set forth in Executive Order 1377. The task force has sent 2 reports to the Secretary, one on May 24th and one on September 30th. At the time of the second progress report, the task force had reviewed 120 regulations and 19 Defense Federal Acquisition Regulation Supplement clauses. So far, the Department has identified approximately over $10 million in savings and have identified 88 rules that it may be able to repeal, subject to final review by the Office of Management and Budget. Most of the task force's recommendations thus far have been to eliminate or modify unnecessary, outdated, or ineffective regulations, and several reviews have resulted in recommendations to consolidate rules into a single DoD-level rule, which will provide the public with one governing, unifying regulation and consistent application of rules on the public. To provide an opportunity for public engagement, the task force published notices for comment being reviewed by the task force and the 3 subgroups, and has updated its public-facing website to provide additional transparency. DoD understands that a key component of the regulatory reform efforts is the implementation and sustainment efforts. To that end, the department's components have already started the implementation phase of those recommendations that have been approved, and the task force is closely tracking those regulatory actions. Currently, the task force has reviewed 17% of its codified regulations, and we are on track to meet our goal to review all of the codified regulations by the end of 2018. Mr. Chairman, regulatory reform is a part of the Secretary's overall reform strategy, and DoD believes that the deregulatory actions and cost savings of our reform efforts will help reduce unnecessary burdens on the public and promote agency accountability. I thank the Chairman, ranking members, and the subcommittees for this opportunity to discuss the regulatory reform efforts, and I'm happy to take any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chung. Mr. Breezy, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Meadows, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Connolly, Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, and members of the subcommittees, it is a pleasure to appear before you today to discuss GSA's Regulatory Reform Task Force and regulatory reform activities in accordance with Executive Order 13771, Reducing Regulation and Controlling Regulatory Costs, and Executive Order 13777, Enforcing the Regulatory Reform Agenda. My name is Giancarlo Breezy, and I am the General Services Administration's Principal Deputy Associate Administrator in the Office of Government-Wide Policy. As one of the federal government's central management agencies, GSA strives through its regulations to provide a policy framework that affords agencies the flexibility to accomplish their missions in the most effective manner while adhering to laws, executive orders, government-wide memoranda, and other applicable requirements and sound management practices. GSA accomplishes this through 4 comprehensive regulations: the Federal Property Management Regulation, the Federal Management Regulation, the Federal Travel Regulation, and the GSA Acquisition Regulation. Building on the intent and spirit of the executive orders, GSA expanded the scope of its review to include non-regulatory policies and practices. This provides an opportunity to review GSA's day-to-day work activities that will lead to better service for our customer agencies and ultimately the American people. GSA is fully committed to complying with Executive Order 13771 and is currently pursuing a number of deregulatory actions that will reduce the burden on vendors doing business with the government. EO 13777 required GSA to appoint a regulatory reform officer, establish a regulatory reform task force, and evaluate existing regulations and make recommendations to the agency head regarding their repeal, replacement, and modification. Accordingly, GSA formally established its Regulatory Reform Task Force, comprised of GSA's Regulatory Reform Officer, Regulatory Policy Officer, Senior Procurement Executive, and 2 operational subject matter experts. It was important that GSA's task force have both policy and operational perspectives as we reviewed our regulations, internal policies, and practices. GSA's Regulatory Reform Task Force established 4 working groups consisting of subject matter experts to review regulatory and non-regulatory policies and practices that will result in recommending proposals in alignment with the objectives of EO 13777. GSA's task force working groups are organized around the agency's primary functions and guidelines, or regulations. The working group solicited reform proposals within the agency, in the case of travel, from 17 other federal agencies that volunteered to contribute to the review. To ensure public engagement, each of the 4 working groups published a notice in the Federal Register to solicit reform proposals from the public. These activities have generated over 2,000 regulatory reform comments, including nearly 1,800 proposals generated by GSA's internal working groups and input from other federal agencies. Examples of regulatory reform proposals currently under review or being pursued include making it easier for vendors to do business with GSA. More specifically, GSA is looking for ways to remove outdated requirements in the GSA acquisition regulation that require contractors to submit multiple reports or redundant information. Other proposals under consideration are non-regulatory, but important nonetheless, include making regulations more accessible to users on mobile devices or simplifying internal forms. We are optimistic that regulatory and non-regulatory efforts such as these will in the aggregate have a significant impact on improving GSA's regulatory and operational landscape. After the working groups finish their initial reviews, they may seek clarifications from the submitters to ensure full understanding and will ultimately make recommendations to the task force. The task force will then consider the recommendations, consult with necessary internal, external advisors, and then we'll make a formal recommendation to the GSA administrator. I'm grateful for the opportunity to update the subcommittees on GSA's Regulatory Reform Task Force and look forward to working with the committee and subcommittees as GSA continues its efforts. Thank you for your time today, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you. Dr. Owens, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Meadows, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Connolly, Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, and members of the subcommittees. I am James Owens, Acting General Counsel of the Department of Transportation. I am grateful for the opportunity to present to you the Department's progress on regulatory reform under Secretary Chow's leadership. DOT has one of the largest rulemaking portfolios in the federal government. To carry out its responsibilities, the Department embraces a regulatory philosophy that emphasizes transparency, stakeholder engagement, and regulatory restraint. Our goal is to allow the public to understand how we make decisions, which includes being transparent in the way we measure the risks, costs, and benefits of engaging in or deciding not to engage in a particular regulatory action. The Department also embraces the notion that there should be no more regulations than necessary. We emphasize consideration of non-regulatory solutions and have rigorous processes in place for continual reassessment of existing regulations. The executive orders issued by President Trump at the beginning of this administration have been instrumental in helping the Department achieve regulatory reform goals. In response to the executive orders, the Department formed a regulatory reform task force. Our task force consists of 2 components: a working group that meets with each of our operating administrations once per month, and a leadership council. Senior career and non-career officials are members of the task force. In carrying out its work, the task force is guided by 3 principles. First, reduce the unnecessary regulatory burden on the public without compromising safety. Second, further stretch taxpayer dollars by streamlining the infrastructure permitting process. And third, enable innovation by removing unnecessary regulatory barriers to transformative technologies. Through our ongoing review and revision of DOT regulations, we have been able to save the American public significant time and money without reducing the safety of our nation's transportation system. DOT rules issued in fiscal 2016 under the previous administration imposed an estimated $3.2 billion in annualized costs. In contrast, rules issued under this administration in fiscal 2017 resulted in approximately $21.9 million in annualized cost savings. In addition, rules anticipated to be issued in 2018 are currently projected to yield substantially increased annualized cost savings. In effect, we hope not only to continue to save the American taxpayers money, but to save them more money and faster. Approximately 12% of DOT rulemaking actions issued in the previous administration were deregulatory. We expect that in fiscal 2018, the number of deregulatory actions will increase to approximately half of all DOT rulemakings. One of the Department's goals in reducing regulatory burden is to streamline the permitting process to further stretch taxpayer dollars by enabling faster, better, and more efficient infrastructure development. The Department has sought stakeholder input to assist in this effort, and in June 2017, we published a request for public comment asking for input to help identify obstacles to infrastructure projects. In response, we received over 200 comments containing over 1,000 ideas, and we are currently reviewing those ideas. Other steps the Department is taking to expedite project delivery include a proposal to encourage public-private partnership in transit project delivery and the issuance of updated guidance to help streamline environmental reviews. Another of the Department's goals in reducing regulatory burden is to enable innovations that will transform transportation. We believe that the transportation of the future will be better, faster, cheaper, and safer than it is today, and we are eager to do what we can to make that a reality. This administration is committed to enabling innovative and new uses of transportation technology, whether that involves automated vehicles, unmanned aircraft systems, or other emerging technologies. Although the Department has made great progress in implementing the administration's regulatory reform agenda, our work continues, and we anticipate continued deregulatory progress in fiscal 2018, including plans to consider potential burdens caused by non-binding agency guidance documents. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss with you the Department's regulatory reform agenda. I would be pleased to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Owens. Thank all of you for your insightful testimony here. We're going to, since we went ahead and started, I'm going to go ahead and recognize our ranking members for their opening statement. I first recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy, and for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Jordan and Chairman Meadows, for convening this hearing. I'd also like to thank Ranking Member Connolly, who couldn't be here, but he's displayed incredible leadership on this committee as well. And I'd like to commend all our witnesses for participating today, so thank you very much. There's an old saying that there's no Republican or Democratic way to pick up the trash or fill a pothole. The only thing that matters is that you deliver for your constituents. I think that's a good mindset to have as we look to improve efficiencies and cut unnecessary regulations. This shouldn't be done with any partisan preconceptions, but rather with a dispassionate and a rational mindset. In my career as a small businessman, we made our business decisions based on facts and numbers. If a product wasn't selling, we would investigate why. If we had to change our products or services, we did so because our research told us that what we had been doing wasn't working. We did this because we had a clear goal in mind. We wanted to sell the best products and services and keep making money for our shareholders. No matter how brilliant I thought my ideas were, I would be letting down my partners and our customers if I insisted on selling a product that our customers didn't want to buy. I strive to bring that mindset to Congress as well. If a policy or a change in regulation moves us toward what my constituents sent me here to do, I'd be happy to support it. I don't think many people in Schaumburg, Illinois, my hometown, expected that my first major legislation to be co-led by a Republican in rural Pennsylvania named Representative Thompson. But that's what we had to do because we had a shared goal of improving career and technical education. That is why today I'm particularly troubled by recent administrative moves to undermine, for instance, health protections and the coverage that millions of Americans have come to depend on. The Department of Health and Human Services recently decided to cut its open enrollment period in half because it appeared to be a move that was based on ideology, not practical circumstances. Shutting down the website on the first day of enrollment period and cutting down the enrollment period in half would only serve to hurt our customers of that service, not help them. So today, I hope that the testimony that we hear shows that agencies are making decisions based on facts and not ideology. I hope we hear that the testimony that you provide today shows that agencies are devising effective regulation, not just deregulation at any cost. I'm very grateful to the chairman for calling this hearing so we can further investigate the reasons behind administrative actions and the policy goals that they serve, and provide comment and insight on how agencies can more effectively serve the American people. I look forward to discussing this more with the witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from the great state of Illinois and my dear friend, Ms. Kelly, for her opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing to examine the agency regulatory reform task forces established by the current administration under Executive Order 13777 and to evaluate implementation of Executive Order 13771, which requires agencies to propose a repeal of 2 regulations in order to issue a new rule. And thank you to the witnesses. Since January 20th, this Congress and the administration have overturned, delayed, or repealed dozens of regulations that were issued during the Obama administration. Under this administration, employers have fewer requirements to protect their employees from exposure to toxic chemicals. Airlines can be more opaque regarding baggage fees, and people with mental disabilities can more readily purchase guns. Important rules to ensure clean air and water are being rolled back. All of this is being done under the guise of cost savings, but I fear that it is being done without considering the impact on all Americans. To get an overview of how Executive Orders 13777 and 13771 are being implemented and what direction the White House or the Office of Management and Budget has given to agencies to execute these two executive orders, the committee should hear from Director Mulvaney, a former member of this committee, and Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs Administrator Niama Rayo. It is critical that we understand that overarching strategies for this administration's regulatory agenda, considering the aggressive steps this administration has taken to repeal or otherwise halt rules that were carefully crafted under the previous administration. The administration's regulatory task forces were established ostensibly to identify costly, unnecessary regulations that can be repealed. The administration has not provided Congress with membership lists for the task forces, and we are forced to glean what information we can from public reporting. These task forces appear to be filled with industry lobbyists acting on behalf of special interests, and agencies are moving to repeal regulations that benefit industry with little regard to health and safety of the public. It is also unclear with whom these task forces are meeting, whether they are balancing the interests of industry with those of consumers and other parties, and which rules these task forces have recommended for repeal. We do not know which, if any, rules have been repealed at the suggestion of the task forces. The opaqueness of these task forces, from their members to their actions, is of great concern. Further, Congress has no way of knowing to what extent members of the task forces are subject to conflicts of interest laws and executive orders, if at all, and if any ethic waivers have been issued to these members. I am not taking a second look. I am not against taking, a second look at the regulations. There may be some that need to be repealed and some that need to be strengthened. However, any regulatory action undertaken by agencies must be done in a transparent manner with public input from all stakeholders, not just those who would benefit from a regulatory repeal. Congress must be assured agencies are not repealing existing regulations at a cost to the health and well-being of Americans. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and thank the chairman again for holding this important oversight hearing.
I thank the gentlewoman. Again, as we go back and forth, we ask that members, if you will just be very cognizant of the clock, and I'll be gentle on my gavel, but I want to make sure that we get everybody in to ask questions. So the chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Mitchell, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And there you go. Any hope of a bipartisan committee meeting just went by the wayside. Let me ask you for a brief response, if I can. Do any of you believe that the executive orders has in some way hindered your ability to effectively protect the American people?
No, sir.
Mr. Owens, Dr. Owens.
No, sir.
Ms. Chung.
No, sir.
So, to be clear, you don't believe the executive order to clean up outdated duplicative regulations has somehow put the American people at massive risk of in some form. We're good on that point, right, at this point? The task forces are required to review regulations on a variety of broad categories, including eliminate jobs or job creation, to look at the cost-benefit analysis, deal with duplicative regulations. Have your agencies created additional criteria by which you look at what regulations you're going to consider? How else are you analyzing those?
We have not created new additional considerations. We continue to look at the traditional cost-benefit analysis in determining which rules to move forward with and which rules not to move forward with.
Mr. Breese?
Sir, we have not changed the criteria, though we have added new criteria for which we look at not just regulations. We're doing a much more comprehensive review to include internal policies and practices. We want to make sure that we can target things that have a high impact with relatively ease in implementation. So there are a number of factors that we look at.
You refer to high impact, Mr. Breese. Give me a better definition of high impact, please.
Yes, sir. Those items that could have a large influence on the either constituents, whether it's small businesses or large businesses doing business with the government, making their life easier in terms of doing business with us, or it could be internal management regulations that have an impact on federal employees who abide by those.
Ms. Chung?
We have also not changed our criteria. We've looked at all of our regulations under the existing cost-benefit analysis that is required for all regulatory actions.
Thank you. One of the concerns that has arisen from some of the comments already today is that somehow the review of these regulations has been turned over to political ideologues. I'd ask each of you, maybe starting with Ms. Chung, have career staff been directly engaged in this process, and how extensively, please?
The DoD task force is primarily composed of career staff. I'm a career official, and we're primarily majority are composed of career officials.
Let me ask you, Ms. Chung, in selecting people for the task force, was there some political ideology determined of who would be selected in your department?
No, sir. We decided to take a comprehensive approach to look at all of our regulations, so we decided to naturally look to appointing people on the task force that had the most regulations.
I would hope.
So we have members from the 3 departments, members from the undersecretaries that have the most regulations, sure, and general counsel, of course. We have a working level group as well that composed of subject matter experts that review the regulations before they go to the task force. So that's how we've conducted our process.
Mr. Brice.
Yes, sir. The committee or the Regulatory Reform Task Force at GSA is comprised of 5 members, 3 of which are career employees, 2 are political. But most of the work and review is being conducted by working groups comprised of career individuals or subject matter experts in the particular field or regulation that they're reviewing.
And Dr. Owens.
Our task force includes both career and non-career officials. Our working group consists of senior career experts, including the Assistant General Counsel for Regulations, the Executive Director for Policy, and the Career Deputy General Counsel. And then we work very closely with career experts in the different operating administrations as part of the general review process going forward.
Dr. Owens, in terms of your task force, you didn't give me much of a breakdown in terms of career folks versus political appointees. Can you give me an estimate of what that is?
So on the working group, we have 4 non-career appointees and 3 career appointees. We additionally have a leadership group that is comprised of the Regulatory Reform Officer and other senior political leadership, but that is more of a review body that receives recommendations from the working group and ultimately from career staff.
So is it an accurate description, in your opinion, that much of the review of these regulations is driven by long-term career staff that are subject matter experts and know this better than a whole lot of us political folks?
Absolutely. We could not do our jobs without the career experts and their professional assistants.
Ms. Chung?
Yes, absolutely. I would support that statement.
And Mr. Brice?
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. I'll yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm concerned that agencies are rolling back regulation documents, not necessarily based on evidence, but based on a political agenda or without full information. Just last week, the Department of Education announced it was repealing 72 guidance documents related to special education. These documents do everything from informing states on what processes they are to follow to receive grant funding, to ensuring that students with disabilities are included in all educational activities. Some of these guidance documents had been on the books as far back as 1980. While the Department of Education put out a general request for comment on its regulatory reform plans, disability advocates had no opportunity to comment on the repeal of these same guidance documents. The department, unfortunately, didn't have all the facts from everyone affected. I would like to ask each of our witnesses here today a similar question. Ms. Chung, is the Department of Defense repealing or considering the repeal of any guidance documents And if so, are you going to issue a notice for comment in the Federal Register to allow all interested parties to comment if you are planning to repeal any guidance documents?
Sir, while reviewing internal guidance documents is not a part of this DoD's regulatory task force purview, the department is considering those, and I'm happy to take that back for the record and provide you additional information on the process.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Chung. Mr. Breezy, is the GSA repealing or considering the repeal of any guidance documents?
I'm not aware of any repeal of guidance documents, though anything that were to come to consideration before the task force would be considered, discussed, and we would engage with stakeholders, whether it's other federal agencies or industry groups, as to the perspective or impact it may have on those individuals.
So you would issue a notice for comment in the Federal Register to allow all interested parties to comment if you intend to repeal any guidance documents?
It would either be through a Federal Register notice or some other means, whether it's Industry Day or some type of public engagement with those individuals. Not sure whether it would be a Federal Register notice, but some type of engagement.
Dr. Owens, a similar question. Is the Department of Transportation repealing or considering the repeal of any guidance documents, sir?
We're at the very beginning of our review of guidance documents. We want to be sure that all guidance documents that have been issued by the department or will be issued in the future are in compliance with statute, including the Administrative Procedure Act. We want to make sure that we are not creating new law through guidance documents. We also are undertaking a review of our guidance documents, and where we determine that the guidance document may stray beyond the legislative requirements, we will put that out for notice and comment. We are also ensuring that significant guidance going forward will be put out for notice and comment before it would come into effect.
Got it. So if you do intend to repeal any of the guidance documents, you will put it out for notice and comment in the Federal Register?
That would be my expectation in most instances. There are obviously minor guidance documents such as changes of forms and the like that would not rise to the level of going out for notice and comment, but certainly anything that is significant we would expect to seek public input.
I'd like to, thank you. I'd like to ensure that, if there is a repeal of any guidance documents, that you do put it out for notice and comment, because that's so important for stakeholders to have a say in your intended action. I have another similar question. Ms. Chung, what is the Department of Defense doing to ensure the public has an opportunity to comment on changes to regulations undertaken by your Regulatory Reform Task Force?
Sir, the department has published notices for comment for all of the reviews that the task force is conducting. We have received and published notices for comments for the subgroups regulations that we're reviewing. For two of our subgroups, we have received many comments. For example, in the regulations for the Army Corps of Engineers, we've already received over 1,000 comments, and we're currently reviewing all of those comments for consideration. In addition, we have published, we've updated our website on our regulatory reform website, which includes a frequently asked questions section. We have our most recent reports to the Secretary published. We have our membership list. We have our various documents explaining our process and our terms of references on that website.
Got it. Mr. Breezy, can you answer the same question, and then Dr. Owens?
Yes, we have published Federal Register notices seeking comments on our 4 regulations. We have received a number of those comments and are going through the review process. Should it result in any type of change to a particular regulation, we would go through the regulatory process and do a Federal Register notice for public comment.
Got it. Finally, Dr. Owens.
So over the summer, we published a Federal Register notice soliciting public comment on infrastructure improvement. We received over 1,000 ideas pursuant to that solicitation. A couple of weeks ago, we put out another Federal Register notice soliciting public comment on regulatory reform generally, and we are looking forward to receiving those comments. In addition, any substantive action the department takes on rulemaking will go out for notice and comment pursuant to the APA.
Thank you very much.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our panel for being here and each of you for your leadership with these executive orders. I can only imagine in receiving an executive order and beginning to implement that, you're going to have some people within the agencies rather excited to update some regulations and probably some not so excited about it. So just kind of overall, have you received any pushback from career staff at your various agencies?
We have not at DOD. I think what has resonated very nicely with the DOD workforce is explaining why these regulatory reform efforts are should be undertaken. And so going back to the regulatory principles and the philosophy has really resonated with the workforce. So we have not received any pushback.
At GSA, we have not received any pushback from either career or anybody else we have engaged with. In fact, if anything, they see this as an opportunity not to only review the regulations that we have, but more importantly, looking at all of our day-to-day activities, our guidance documents, and that's what they're really excited about. Those are the things that impact them on a day-to-day basis and an ability to voice their opinions and possibly achieve change and making their lives better.
At DOT, we've been impressed by our career staff. They have been extremely supportive of our efforts. It's not only our efforts, it's their efforts as well. And without their support, without their expert guidance, we would not be able to move forward with this process.
Well, I'm impressed with it as well, with each of your answers there. That's pretty fascinating. So you, with regulations, with being duplicative or burdensome or whatever it may be, you're receiving no pushback. Why? In one or two sentences, why is it that your agencies are excited to proceed with doing away with these? We'll just go down the line again, Ms. Chung.
I'll be honest, I think it's very satisfying at the department to unify certain policies and requirements under one regulation. And I think the workforce is satisfied in that unity that this brings.
At GSA, on the onset, we took a lot of time to consider the process of which we would go through the regulatory review, and we approached it in a manner that allowed input from not only the employees that are dealing with it day to day, but also engaging other agencies, which had never been done before. And that's what has the employees excited. They're not just looking at it from their own input, but from the stakeholder perspective as well. And again, that's what has them excited.
At Transportation, our career experts have a long tradition, a long culture of pursuing cost-benefit analysis, of seeking data, a data-driven process to improve all of our regs, to improve safety. And so as we have been working with them and they understand that we are working through and following the sound science in all of our analysis, we have extreme support from them.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate the you know, it's the stakeholders out there that are living under these regulations, and it's encouraging to me to have some government agencies excited about helping people who are just suffocating under so much regulatory burdens. So let's just continue. That you guys are doing great with this. Let's continue. As far as the transparency to the public, are your changes online, or are there plans to put them online for the public to see?
Yes, sir. Our regulatory reform efforts are on our website, our regulatory reform website, and our recommendations to the secretaries or reports are on the website. Our process of how we conduct our reviews are all on our website.
From a transparency perspective, the Federal Register notices, the comments that we received are public and available. Additionally, the transparency that we've undertaken is working with the agencies, those agencies that are impacted by our internal management regulations. And so they're part of the process. They're seeing the recommendations. They're going through them and doing the analysis with us and then putting forward recommendations for change.
What about the general public?
We're also engaging stakeholders, such as small businesses and large businesses, those who do business with the government, such as Reverse Industry Day, where they came in, walked us through what they're doing when we're going through the acquisition process. And that input was extremely valuable in us looking at what we're doing, how we could possibly shape it to improve it for them.
Great. Mr. Owens.
We value transparency at transportation. We've published our task force reports on the internet. We also publish a monthly internet report of all of our rulemakings and where they stand. We also have continual outreach to external stakeholders and to the public. We want to solicit all good ideas, and we want to make sure the public is engaged in our process.
Well, again, thank you very much for what you're doing, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Chair recognizes Ms. Kelly for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm concerned that the Executive Order 13771, which requires the repeal of 2 rules for every 1 rule issued, will impair the health, safety, and welfare of the American public. The Executive Order does not apply to, and I quote, regulations issued with respect to a military function. Ms. Chung, why was this provision added to the Executive Order?
I believe that is an exception as well in the Administrative Procedure Act, and so the executive order was following that line of rationale.
But you don't know the rationale?
It's an exemption under the Administrative Procedure Act.
It seems that the President did not want to impose heavy deregulatory burdens on the military. Ms. Chung, is all of the Department of Defense exempted from Executive Order 13771, or are some things it does affected by the order?
No, the entire Department of Defense's activity is not exempted from the executive order. The regulations that we're reviewing, all of the 716 are reviewed under the criteria for 13771, and we work with the Office of Management and Budget in identifying significant rules under that order.
Okay. Did the Department of Defense advise the President not to apply the executive order to military regulations?
To my knowledge, no.
Had Executive Order 13771 been applied to military regulations, what impact would that have had they been applied?
So currently, when we look at the rules under 13771, there could be an exemption that applies to the regulation as being exempt as a military function. So some of those rules could meet that exemption. As a whole, all of the regulations that we're reviewing, they do not wholly meet that exemption. So we are working with OMB to determine which rules would meet that exemption or which would not.
Okay, it seems to me that Executive Order 13771 could have had a serious impact on our military. It similarly could be having a serious impact on regulations, which keeps the average American safe. Mr. Owens, do you think that Executive Order 13771 is having or will have an impact on safety regulations the Department of Transportation is issuing?
No, ma'am. The safety is our #1 priority, and our intention is to, in identifying unnecessary regulatory burdens, we are looking to remove those burdens without compromising safety.
Thank you. Do you think there would be more safety regulations issued by DOT if the executive order did not apply to the department, and just as how it does not apply to the military?
I do not think that there would be more safety regulations in the absence of the executive order. Again, we take safety extremely seriously. We apply a cost-benefit analysis to everything we do, which the department has always done. And any time that the safety benefits or the overall benefits of society exceed the costs, that is a rulemaking we want to engage in.
Okay, thank you. And I'm glad to hear that safety is #1, because I have concern that Executive Order 13771 is putting Americans in harm's way and should be repealed immediately. Thank you. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the president of the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer, which is not on either of the subcommittees, but I ask unanimous consent that he be allowed to fully participate in today's hearing without objection. So ordered. The chair recognizes Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just have a few questions, and some of it's follow-up. But in a broader sense, considering some of the reports that have been issued showing that regulations cost our economy approximately $1.9 trillion a year, Some of the feedback I've gotten from private sector is that they're dealing with obsolete regulations, or they're dealing with duplications, and in some cases contradictions. Ms. Chung, is there an effort to take a broader look at the regulations to eliminate the obsolete, what I guess you could call the low-hanging fruit?
Yes, sir. That was the approach that we took at the outset, is to schedule our reviews by topics in order to review regulations that are of similar requirements, to identify rules that we could consolidate and that we could eliminate if they were outdated. So that was certainly one of the first ways that we were looking at the regulations.
What I've found in talking with people is that business is not necessarily averse to regulations. What they find problematic is the lack of clarity. In some cases, I've been told that they're getting contradictory answers. They could call one regulator one week and get an answer, and then a few weeks later call same agency, different regulator, get a different answer. Is that part of the process that we want to bring clarity to our regulations?
Yes, sir. Certainly, that is within what we want to do. One of the goals that we want to achieve in the department is to unify the requirements within our components, and that's, for example, we have been looking at components that have different regulations on the same topic, and consolidating those requirements into one rule so that there is one governing rule and the public understands what that rule and requirement is. So certainly that is the effort.
So, Mr. Breezy, if we just kind of simplified this, the objective here is not just about saving the economy money, it's bringing predictability, it's sensible regulation. Would that be a fair way of describing what we're trying to do?
Yes, sir. GSA is supporting other internal or other agencies across the government. We don't like to think of it in terms of deregulatory or making new regulations. It's about getting the right regulations in place and protecting the taxpayer in terms of funds, making sure that we protect employees across the federal government by understanding what it is and how they need to adhere to laws and guiding principles from the administrations. So it's about getting the right regulations.
Well, the reason I keep pounding on this, Mr. Chairman, is that we're talking about saving the taxpayers' money, but really what we're talking about are consumers, because regulatory cost, some people call it a hidden tax. It's not a hidden tax. I mean, at least a tax might go to build a bridge or a road or fund a school. It's just a hidden cost. And again, the reports indicated that the average household's spending about $15,000 per year in regulatory costs that's added to their burden, and that's particularly a problem for low-income families. So when we talk about regulatory reform, that's one of the things that I think we want to do. We want to make sure that we have the right regulations, that these are clearly written, so that we reduce the amount of burden that's passed on to families. That's a primary goal of mine while I'm in Congress is to try to bring to our regulatory regime clarity and to reduce the burden on families, because I think it's a great idea to, as far as the burden on taxpayers, but it's really just an overall cost of living issue that when we have regulations on top of regulations, you lack clarity. Some of them are obsolete, Ms. Chung. That's just an unnecessary cost. And I hope that as we continue to do this, that we're not compromising public safety. I don't think we are. I think what we're doing is we're trying to remove a tremendous burden on families. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this hearing, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Lawrence, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Department of Transportation is tasked with keeping Americans safe on the road and the skies. However, I'm concerned that the executive order will inhibit the department's ability to do that. A 2012 highway transportation bill required the department to write a rule about rear seat belt reminders. This rule would alert drivers if individuals in the back seat, such as children, are not buckled up. This rule has been delayed and not yet implemented. It was supposed to be finalized in 2015, and it still has not been. To put some reality to my concern, in 2016, over 200 children in Michigan alone, died in car crashes. Over 140 of those children were under the age of 10. This seatbelt rule could have saved some of their lives. Mr. Owens, would it be possible for the department to finalize this rule given the regulatory budgeting requirements in Executive Order 13771?
We are, at DOT, we are committed to completing all rulemakings mandated by Congress, and so we will move forward with every single rulemaking. In terms of a cost analysis, in terms of the cost analysis for the 2-for-1 and the executive orders, that's a different matter that we are focused first and foremost on ensuring that we have our rulemakings done. We will, of course, endeavor to do so in the most cost-beneficial manner possible so that we can maximize the benefits to society and minimize the costs. But I can assure you that anything that is a mandatory rulemaking, something that Congress has required us to do, we will move forward on.
Where are you with the rear seat regulation? Where are you?
I don't have that information in front of me, but we can get back to you on that.
So, Mr. Owens, when the Department of Transportation Task Force is undertaking a review of regulations, is it looking at ways to improve public safety, or is it just looking at reducing the regulatory burdens? And my concern is that in your quest, and you've outlined eloquently, all three of you, how all hands are on deck, and this is a full department engagement, but yet still we have a mandate from Congress that has not been fulfilled. So please tell me, is it one or the other, or what is happening here? Is it improving safety, or is it reducing the regulatory business? And when you answer this, please be honest, because my concern when so many of the people from departments come, you'll say what you think will be nice to hear. If you don't have the manpower, because I'm concerned, 2015 and we still haven't achieved it, and lives are being lost as a result of rear seats not being mandated for children and others, but yet and still you sit here so eloquently talking about how engaged you are in the regulatory reform. So please answer that question for me.
Thank you. We are committed to safety. As our Secretary has said on many occasions, safety is our #1 priority at the Department of Transportation. We are committed to moving forward with all safety rules that are going to create significant benefits for society. So,
but you have not fulfilled the requirement that I'm speaking of.
I can't speak to what occurred in the prior administration, but I can tell you that right now we are looking at every one of the rules that has been mandated by Congress, and we want to move forward with them, and we're conducting the analysis necessary to ensure that we can do so in the best possible way.
That's not really an answer, Mr. Owens. Answer that question. When you're all engaged with the regulatory burdens, reducing them, and improving safety, are those two different lanes? Are they combined so you do one or the other? And do you have the manpower, I'm asking that again, to fulfill this? Because I don't want this rule to continue to sit and you're very excited about looking at regulatory business, which if you protect the employees, updating regulation, creating efficiency, and reducing costs, I'm all for that. But I am extremely concerned about safety issues, and you're not complying in a timely manner.
Thank you. There is no conflict between the EO and safety. We are able to pursue both. I can't speak to our manpower resources, but I can say that we do have resources to move forward. I certainly share your understanding that rulemaking can take, under the APA, can take a very long time. But I can assure you that we are moving forward with all of our mandatory rulemakings with all the energy we can.
I would think, Mr. Chairman, that while we're looking at reducing cost and creating effectiveness, effectiveness means timely response to safety concerns and clearly mandates that you've already received from Congress. Saying it's a long time is not acceptable to me, so that should be one of your top priorities because it does impact safety. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlewoman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Blum, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Meadows. Thank you to our panelists for being here today. Appreciate it very much. I'm a small businessman from the private sector for the last 30 years of my life, so the private sector feels the brunt of over-regulation, and that's why these two executive orders from the President are exciting to me, and I know very, very well received in the private sector. I have a it's kind of a philosophical question, I guess, for each of you. Why does it take an executive order for our agencies to take a regulation, even one, off the books? You know, Ronald Reagan often said the closest thing we have to eternal life on this planet is a government program or a government regulation. Why does it take an executive order?
You know, at the Department of Defense, we did take on a initiative to conduct a regulatory reform effort prior to these executive orders under the prior executive orders. However, I think that the executive orders do provide strengthen agency leadership support and formalizes a process that may not exist. And so I think it just strengthens the leadership engagement.
What does that mean in layman's terms?
So,
that a small business person in Eastern Iowa can understand.
While we were,
and I'm being respectful, but I'm not sure what you just said.
Okay, so we were conducting a regulatory reform initiative, looking at our business process on a regulatory program. Quite honestly, a few years ago, kind of looking
as a result of an executive order.
As a result of existing requirements, executive orders, and law. When these executive orders were issued, it really strengthened the agency leadership and galvanized the workforce and formalized the reform efforts into a task force. So I think
so it takes an executive order to strengthen the agency's leadership. I'd say that isn't leadership. If it takes somebody in the Oval Office to say, you shall do this, that's not leadership. That's just following orders. That's being a good foot soldier, correct? People in the real world don't understand this. Why it takes executive orders, why it takes the President of the United States to say, take a regulation off the books. Is there no incentive to do it?
I mean, no. I mean, we were looking at our regulations to see if they were unnecessary and outdated.
Looking's fine, but
and putting in them and reviewing them and putting them into process. But yes, sir. It does. Sometimes executive orders do strengthen the leadership and commitment to it.
Sir?
For GSA, we have always been looking at our regulations and looking for improvements and ways we can make them better, stronger, easier. So we have conducted reviews, and in fact, a lot of various regulations have been updated because of those internal reviews. I would say, in particular with this executive order, it did bring a new level of enthusiasm, if you will, and brought it up to the forefront in terms of reviewing the regulations. But I would also add that we kind of approached it in a different manner in that we just didn't look at our regulations, but also seized upon the opportunity to look at our internal procedures, policies, and ways that we can change and make it easier.
Is there awareness within government of what these we all want clean air, clean water, all these types of things, but is there an awareness within an agency of what this does to people out there trying to make a living, trying to meet their payroll, trying to provide for their families? Is there an awareness of it? Just be honest.
For GSA, I believe that there is an awareness. We do interact with industry a lot. They do come in and speak to us with regards to our regulations and how it does impact them. As also, anytime we do make any updates to any regulations, past or present or future, we do announce them on the Federal Register. We do get public feedback and engage. So there is awareness. We don't always necessarily act on it because we have to weigh different factors, but we do engage and get that input from.
I'm glad to hear you engage. That's good. Dr. Owens.
I think the Department of Transportation, it's fair to say, has had a long history of applying what's called retrospective regulatory reviews and has long tried to clean up its regulatory structure. I can say that with the new administration, with those of us who joined in January and later, whether or not an executive order had been in place, we would have been making moves to improve and reform our regulatory state, including removing unnecessary regulations where possible.
Without the executive order.
Yes, without the
this process was already moving.
The executive order came very early in the administration, so those of us who joined at that time, we didn't have a lot of time to get institution up and running. But I think it's fair to say that whether or not the executive order had been issued, we at DOT would have been pushing forward with an effort to ensure that we're removing unnecessary regulations.
Based on history and based on the past, most folks would not believe, out there in the real world, would not believe what you just said. Because we don't see it in the private sector. We don't see that at all. So I'm glad that your agency is having the private sector come in and you're listening to them in the GSA. And I would encourage all agencies to listen to the folks that pay our salaries. I yield back the time I don't have, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman from Iowa. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to ask Mr. Breezy, the procurement policies that you've put out saying that the GSA is reviewing its procurement policies for outdated regulations. And as I understand it now, you put out a product you need or say what you need, and you have competitive bidding coming in, and then you make a decision of what is the lowest qualified bidder. But you're going to change this, the proposal that was in the 2018 National Defense Authorization Section 801 would require GSA to establish online marketplaces for the procurement of commercial goods. And I don't quite understand what you mean. In other words, what do you mean by that? In other words, you tell me, what do you mean by that?
I personally cannot speak to that particular legislation or what it's trying to achieve. I certainly can look into it, but I would say certainly we want to engage industry, and we do want to get competitive bids and make sure that when we procure something from the public, that we take in consideration taxpayer money and get the best value possible for the government.
Well, in the bill, in the online marketplace provision, it says that any procurement of a commercial product through the marketplace, and I'm quoting here, shall be made under the standard terms and conditions of the marketplace, and the administrator shall not require an online marketplace to modify its standard terms and conditions. So, for instance, suppliers are required to have a unique identifying number and to agree to certain conditions regarding payment and timing. So does the GSA propose to reconcile these existing requirements with the language of the proposal that would prohibit modification of the online marketplace's terms and conditions?
Again, I can't speak to that particular provision or the legislation that's being proposed, but once, if enacted, we will certainly update and look at our regulations to make sure that they're compliant with any legislation that is passed.
Well, I'd like someone from your office to come over and explain this new National Defense Authorization rule, because the procurement for the Defense Department is absolutely huge. And personally, I like the open bidding practice that says what they need and lets the marketplace respond to them. And this appears to mean that they're going to allow them to purchase online, is how I'm reading it, I could be wrong, instead of going through the competitive bid process. And I don't know if I think that's a good idea. If an online product wants to respond to an RFP or product request from the government or from the Defense Department, then they can do so. Why in the world do we have to change the online ordering programs and say that they can't modify the terms and conditions? I really would like a clarification on it.
Yes, ma'am, we would be happy to provide that.
Okay. And can anyone else comment on the rule? Are you familiar with it, Ms. Chung or Mr. Owens? No.
I'm not.
If the gentlewoman would yield, actually, we had a hearing on that. We'll be glad to get your staff a whole lot of information on that particular issue.
Well, then maybe you can answer my question.
I can't, but I don't want to take up your time, but you go ahead.
Okay.
I'll yield back.
Okay. And I'm concerned about the President's executive orders and what they may have on transportation safety. And a few years ago, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration requested input on upgrades to the new car assessment program. And this program has been an innovative way to spur improvement and upgrades in the auto industry. Mr. Owens, what is the status of upgrading the NCAP to incorporate new technology to save lives? Every day I read about new ways to save lives.
So we are certainly committed to vehicle safety, and we are very excited by the new technologies that are coming into being in the automotive industry. We are evaluating the NCAP program, and we want to ensure that when we update it, it will be updated in the best possible way.
Well, is the executive order having any type of impact on the upgrading of the NCAP program?
No, it does not. The NCAP program is not a regulation in any event, but it would not have an impact on whether we whether and what kinds of upgrades we would do to this. This is a voluntary program that industry engages in, that industry supports very much, and we want to ensure that consumers have the best possible information available to them.
Thank you. All right.
I thank the gentlewoman. The chair recognizes himself for a series of questions. So, Ms. Chung, let me come to you. Mr. Blum from Iowa was, I guess, hitting in on some of the why are you doing it now because of an executive order. Would you suggest that the executive order has given more focus to actually reducing some of the regulations, even though it's been part of your ongoing effort because of the executive order? Do you think that there's more of a focus within your agency on reducing regulations?
Yes, sir. I do. I think it has focused our efforts into and formalize and institutionalize the process.
All right, and so, Dr. Owens, let me come to you, because obviously at DOT there was a whole lot made of safety. Is there ever a time where safety is sacrificed as you're reviewing what regulations to get rid of?
Absolutely not. Safety is our #1 priority, and as we analyze every possible rulemaking, we are looking to maximize safety benefits and other benefits and minimize the costs.
Okay, Dr. Owens, could you make the case that when you have some of these regulations and guidances that are out there that seem to just clog up the works, that the more streamlined you make it, the more you can focus on safety?
I think that's a fair assessment. I think we are looking to remove costs that are unrelated to safety so that industry and the government can focus more on the safety issues.
Okay, Mr. Breezy, let me come to you, because as we look at what GSA is doing and actually trying to streamline the whole regulatory side of things, what would you say has been the biggest impediment to actually getting that done?
I wouldn't say there have been any impediments. It's just a matter of rallying the troops. And
some on my side would suggest that is the deep state or actually staff. But what I'm hearing is actually it's been career staff that has been helping all of you make these kinds of recommendations and changes. Is that correct, Mr. Breezy?
Yes, sir.
So what we're saying is the federal workforce, who has been here for a long time, is actually participating in this, making constructive recommendations on what we can get rid of from a regulatory point of view. Is that correct?
Absolutely, sir, yes.
Ms. Chung, are you finding the same thing?
Absolutely, sir.
Dr. Owens, are you finding the same thing?
That is correct. In one sense, aside from industry and other stakeholders, our career staff are the closest to many of these regs, and many of them understand what is obsolete, what is outdated, what needs to be changed.
Okay, so let me make sure that I send a very clear message to your agencies. One, thank you for the job that you're doing, and today you're getting the applause not only of members of Congress, but certainly the American people who say that regulation after regulation, many times all it does is puts one regulation on top of another that makes it so laborious that they can't figure out what they should abide by and what they shouldn't. But I also want to thank your agencies, those career federal employees who many times get beat up by members of Congress. And I just want to say, would you share with each one of them that we appreciate the fact that they are taking not only this seriously, but that as they embark on that they're making a real difference, saving millions of dollars. Ms. Chung, one of those, I think you said it already saved $10 million. Is that correct? So eventually that adds up to real money, right?
Yes, sir.
All right, so will all three of you take that back?
Happy to forward that message back, Mr. Chairman.
Okay.
Delighted to do so.
Okay. All right. So let me also in just the 1 minute that I have remaining here. An executive order, Mr. Blum was right. You know, why would an executive order be required? Sometimes I have found that there is not an incentive or an encouragement for those who look at things the way that they've always been done and try to look at them in a different manner. And it is critically important that we let them know that that type of focus is there. I mean, there's a bill out there that we're looking at codifying this executive order in law. Would any of you say that would, if we did that it would sacrifice safety or readiness?
I would not believe that would sacrifice safety.
Okay. Mr. Breezy?
I don't believe that to be the case.
Okay. Ms. Chung?
I don't believe so.
All right. Well, thank you, and I will close with this. Dr. Owens, you were talking earlier about guidance and putting it in the Federal Registry and all of that. I want to give you a chance to clarify your statement because I don't know that you actually meant that, because there is not a statutory requirement to do so. And in publishing, in fact, I think the rules that because when I heard that, it kind of hit very quickly, and I think the rules would suggest that rules of an agency, organization, or procedure, or practice, or interpretive rules, or general statements of policy are not really part of the notice requirement for rulemaking. And so since we still have you under oath, not to put words in your mouth, but I assume that you want to abide by the statute but not make a commitment to go beyond what the statute requires. Is that correct?
Absolutely. We will comply with the statute and abide by all rules that apply to guidance documents.
All right. Well, thank you. All of you have been very delightful, and at this point, the first panel is excused. All right, the subcommittees will come to order. I'm pleased to welcome and introduce our second panel. Obviously, all of you were here to hear the first panel as we went through that. We look forward to having your expertise. I'll go ahead and introduce. And as usual, we start out with the most difficult name first. And so Mr. Gentirdi or Dur?
It's phonetic. You can just literally read it out.
Okay, Mr. Coley, how about that? Well, Managing Director of Deloitte Consulting, welcome, thank you. Ms. Diane Katz, Senior Research Fellow in Regulatory Policy at the Heritage Foundation, welcome. Mr. James Goodwin, Senior Policy Analyst at the Center for Progressive Reform, welcome. And Mr. Clyde Wayne Cruz, Jr., the Vice President of Policy and Director of Technology Studies at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, welcome. Pursuant to committee rules, all witnesses will be sworn in before they testify, so if you will please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? All right, thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. And as a reminder, just 5 minutes on your verbal testimony, but your entire written testimony will be made part of the record. And Mr. Coley, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. So you said I work for Deloitte Consulting, and I do, but the reason I'm here is because I served for 4 years as the head of the British Better Regulation Executive, and in that capacity, I led our regulatory reform program for the United Kingdom. So we started that journey in about 2005, and have been going ever since in the United Kingdom. And in the remarks today, I really want to talk about some of the lessons from the British experience, which also reflect experience in other countries. So the UK model has been emulated not just by the UK, but also by other countries in Europe. The Netherlands, Denmark would be some of those countries. Australia, New Zealand, Canada would be others of those countries. And indeed, the concept of 1 in, 2 out now acknowledged by the Trump administration is a concept that was invented in London, indeed in the organization I worked for. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the UK experience. So in the period I was responsible for better regulation, serving Prime Minister Tony Blair and then Prime Minister Gordon Brown, we made a commitment to reduce the administrative burden of regulation by 25%. And over that period of time, we took out £3.5 billion pounds of cost from British business. Given that the UK economy is about 7 times smaller than the US economy, and given the UK economy, the pound is a stronger currency, less strong now than it was maybe a year ago or a year and a half ago, but nevertheless a stronger currency, that gives you a sense of the savings. So what are the lessons of that experience? We were very much the pioneers of that, of how to do regulatory reform and how to do it in a sustainable and effective way. So the first lesson that I would say is that you have to focus on the cost of regulations, not the number. Businesses don't care about the number of pages or the number of regulations that are out there. They care about the actual cost that they face. Indeed, they don't really care about the regulation itself. What they care about is the cost imposed by the regulation. So if they don't understand a regulatory requirement and they end up spending more time understanding it, that's a real cost. If, however, a 1,000-page regulation only touches one business in the land and doesn't impose much cost, it's a very minimal cost. So very much the focus in the United Kingdom was to think about real cost on real businesses. And only when we could demonstrate a real cost reduction on real businesses did we count that. So one lesson I would take away is that, and certainly if you look at the administration's 1 in, 2 out policy, there are obviously some risks there if you look at just the number of regulations. Secondly, in our experience, it was essential to focus on maintaining protections at the same time as trying to reduce costs. if you were unable to maintain protections, you couldn't get the kind of consensus that you needed in order to drive regulatory improvement. In the UK, we called it better regulation. We didn't call it more regulation. We didn't call it deregulation, and that was a very intentional decision. Our policy was to focus on how we regulated in order to make it better for the business community, whilst at the same time maintaining protections that are essential for our society. As a result, we focused on simple things, simplifying forms, automating processes. They're the kind of things that yield very significant savings for business and yet are far away from the political limelight and have a real impact. The third lesson, I'd say, is avoid exclusions. A regulatory reform policy can only be effective if it's broad in its coverage. So, for example, if you bring in new controls on immigration and you're committed to a regulatory reform policy, you have to require offsets for those as well. And indeed, one of the members earlier was talking about the risks of exclusions. Of course, you might need some flexibility if the Transportation Security Administration requires limiting liquids going through airport security, as we all know they did. It would have been difficult for them immediately to bring in an offset. But actually, they did bring in offsets later of sorts. They brought in TSA PreCheck, which we know saves people time and money. But maybe if you had an effective regulatory reform policy, might make that happen faster. The fourth thing we learned is this is almost entirely about small businesses. Small businesses are the entrepreneurial engine of the economy, and unlike large organizations which have compliance departments, small businesses' compliance department is the entrepreneur, often at 11 p.m. at night. And so focusing on protecting that small business and supporting that small business to succeed is what we want to do. I spent a lot of time with small businesses, and the thing I heard most of all is we want regulation. We believe in the outcomes that regulation is there for, but we want it to be easier to comply. And so that's where we put our focus. I'm aware of time. The last thing I'd say is fundamentally this is about culture change. What we were trying to do was change the culture of government. And indeed now, with new techniques such as advanced analytics, it's easier to change the culture of government. So regulatory reform for us was about driving sustainable culture change. And indeed, the UK is still on that journey.
Thank you so much. Ms. Katz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. As we examine the administration's regulatory reform agenda, I'd like to provide some context about the regulatory landscape that the agenda is intended to reform. But before I even do that, it's driving me crazy. I have to correct an apparent misunderstanding on the part of some members about what these executive orders can and cannot do with respect to
Are you suggesting that members are sometimes confused, Ms. Katz?
Well, I'm not going to go there.
Go ahead.
Under no circumstance can the task forces or agencies summarily get rid of health and safety regulations. If there's a statutory requirement, they're still required to fulfill that. And if they want to change it, they have to go through the same process by which the original rule was created, which is a long, protracted, and very transparent process of rulemaking. Thank you. For the past several years, I and my colleague James Gattuso have tracked the number and cost of new regulation and compiled the data in our annual Red Tape Rising reports. This year's report, by the way, is titled Red Tape Receding. During its 8 years in power, the Obama administration issued more than 23,000 regulations and increased cumulative regulatory costs by more than $122 billion annually. And that's only counting major rules, nor are dozens of rules issued by independent agencies in the tally. That $122 billion figure was nearly double the $68 billion imposed under the administration of President George W. Bush. On the day President Trump took office, his administration inherited some 1,900 actions in the rulemaking pipeline. And as the number of regulations has grown, so too has government spending on administration and enforcement. The pace of new regulation during the Obama years was unparalleled, but regulatory expansion has been occurring for decades under both Democratic and Republican administrations. The need for reform has never been greater, and the Heritage Foundation's 2017 Index of Economic Freedom documents the urgency. For the 9th time in the past 10 years, the U.S. has lost ground compared to other countries. In the business freedom component of the index, which measures the regulatory burden, the U.S. this year registered its lowest score ever. The benefits of reform are numerous and well documented, particularly for lower income Americans who bear a disproportionate burden from regulation. But progress is hard to come by. As you know, the federal regulatory apparatus is immense, convoluted, and lethargic, and it involves decades of legislative, executive, and judicial edicts. So that means no single reform will be enough to rein it all in. A variety of systemic and strategic reforms are needed, and we should welcome any new approaches. The most important component of any reform proposal is that it focus our attention and agencies' attention on reform. My written testimony details the administration's reform efforts in its first 6 months, but I'll briefly address EO 13777 and EO 13771. And obviously everyone here knows what those are. Although agencies are currently required to document that the benefits of a new regulation exceed the costs through a cost-benefit analysis, there's no constraint on the accumulation of new regulatory costs. Regulatory budgeting has the potential to inject some badly needed discipline and rationality into the rulemaking process if its operational challenges can be addressed. The 2-for-1 requirement puts some long-needed muscle behind the multiple but non-binding White House directives for agencies to conduct retrospective review. But there's some practical challenges that may affect these EO's utility, and I detail responses in my written testimony. But suffice it to say that we're at the point in time when we need to do something more than has been done in the past. The administration has taken a very good step in starting. We'll have to see over the long term what it's able to accomplish, but there's also lots that Congress needs to do as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Katz. Mr. Goodwin, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Meadows, Chairman Jordan, Ranking Member Connolly, and Ranking Member Krishnamurthy, and members of the subcommittees. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on the Trump administration's ill-conceived regulatory reform task forces, their lack of adequate transparency and meaningful public participation, and indeed, whether their efforts to undermine the regulatory safeguards we all depend on should be taking place at all. My prepared testimony for the record makes 3 points. 1, regulations are essential for safeguarding the public. 2, the Trump administration's task forces and the regulatory review processes that they were created to carry out are fundamentally flawed as both a theoretical and practical matter. Their work threatens to do much more harm than good, and this experiment in regulatory reform should be abandoned. 3, given the Trump administration is unlikely to abandon the pillars of his assault on public safeguards, Congress must be vigilant and must conduct vigilant and thorough oversight of the task forces in the work they undertake. I conclude by offering some recommendations on what this oversight might entail. My oral presentation will focus on these latter 2 points. Point 1, the Trump administration's regulatory reform task forces and their work suffer from at least 4 fundamental flaws. 1, the public harms they will create. 2, their lack of a rational policy basis. 3, their continuing disregard of fundamental norms of administrative law. And 4, their intractable implementation problems. Today I will focus my remarks on the task force's disregard of fundamental norms of administrative law. As William Funk, a leading scholar on the subject, has noted, transparency and public accountability are 2 of the essential hallmarks of U.S. administrative law. Fidelity to these principles is essential to ensuring that agencies are dutifully fulfilling the missions that Congress has set out for them in their authorizing statutes. Transparency assists Congress in performing its oversight activities more effectively, while public participation serves as a mechanism for connecting the abstract goals that Congress has articulated in statutes to the practical realities of the world in which the implementing regulations will give life to those goals. Therefore, Congress in particular has an especially strong interest in ensuring that regulatory actors comport with the principles of transparency and public participation, and Congress in particular should be outraged when regulatory actors defy those principles. To this point, the operation of the Trump administration's regulatory reform task forces has been marked by a distinct lack of transparency and balanced public participation, rendering them susceptible to abuse by narrow interests. With regard to transparency, Executive Order 13777 imposes no real mandates on agency task forces to operate in an open manner that would allow for meaningful public accountability or congressional oversight. The order does not mandate that agencies disclose the identity of their task force members. The task forces are not subject to any open meeting requirements. The task forces never need to explain the basis for the recommendations. Indeed, these recommendations never need to be disclosed at all. With regard to public participation, individual agency task forces have taken wildly divergent approaches to seeking public input, suggesting that this process is at best a low priority and at worst window dressing. When agencies did solicit public input, it was debatable whether these opportunities truly offered members of the public a credible avenue for impacting the task force's recommendations. The deadlines for submitting comments were often too short, and these deadlines often fell right before or even after agency task forces were required to submit their initial reports of recommendations. Point 2. Going forward, Congress will have an important role to play in supervising the regulatory reform task forces. I outlined some steps that they should take as part of this. The first step this and other committees should take is to make full use of their oversight and information gathering authorities. The second step Congress should take is to monitor the deregulatory actions the Trump administration is carrying out to ensure that they are complying with applicable procedural safeguards. My prepared testimony outlines several criteria that Congress may wish to use to inform these monitoring efforts. As a third step, this and other relevant committees should commit to taking appropriate and effective responses whenever they identify potential instances of agencies failing to abide by their administrative law responsibilities. As a fourth and final step, this committee may wish to investigate on an ongoing basis other matters of critical importance that are relevant to the work of the Trump administration's task forces, such as the degree to which their work comports with basic administrative law principles such as transparency and balanced public participation. Thank you. I'd be pleased to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. Mr. Cruz, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning. I'm Wayne Cruz, Vice President for Policy.
You can pull the mic a little bit closer if it's on there.
Vice President for Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and I thank the chairman and the members for the invitation to address regulatory reform task forces, 2-for-1 rule pacing, and cost management. These steps reaffirm sound regulatory review and agency engagement, but will best function within a framework of improved congressional accountability for what regulators do. Politics obscures it now, but alongside overseas development like Britain's 1 in 3 out, proposals to monitor regulatory costs have deep bipartisan pedigree. Regulatory budgeting dates back to Jimmy Carter and to Texas Senator Lloyd Bentsen, who became Clinton Treasury Secretary. A modern bipartisan route of Trump's 1 in 2 out is Senator Mark Warner's 2010 PAYGO. After Trump's first 9 months, and after OIRA's agency directives to include cost allowances in the upcoming unified agenda, what makes us know the task forces are solid ideas? What successes and weaknesses stand out? Reagan's Executive Order 12291 that kick-started OIRA showed that the pen and phone can expand liberty in terms of stabilizing rule counts and Federal Register pages. Trump's reductions appear to be the most significant since then. Meanwhile, dozens of guidance documents have been rescinded, such as the Labor Department proclamations on franchising and independent contracting. But too much of the regulatory apparatus is beyond OIRA's scope. The core reality is that revoking a rule requires another notice and comment rulemaking progression, and long-term, task force machinery can't overcome presidents who deprioritize oversight. Meanwhile, the 800-pound gorilla independent agencies get no OMB scrutiny, even under Trump's orders. And until Trump's orders, guidance documents, memoranda, and other regulatory dark matter rarely got scrutiny either. Also, task forces must address unmeasured categories of intervention that propel costs, not just discrete rules. When government steers while the market merely rose, that creates compounding costs, even if no budgetable rules get issued, such as the re-embrace of public utility models in the tech and telecom sectors. Rules with cost analysis amount to a small percentage of the rulemaking enterprise. That, along with the administrative state's broader weakening of democratic accountability, only strengthens the case for Congress's restoration of Article I checks and balances. In the meantime, as Naomi Rao advises, Congress doesn't have to wait. It can revoke rules if Trump can't. Other steps include boosting OIRA resources and implementing a bipartisan regulatory improvement commission with goals and targets. As for 2-for-1, it may make sense to emphasize equivalent burdens, perhaps dollar for dollar rather than rule for rule. I highlight also the former U.S. regulatory program, a sister document to the federal budget, and a model by which OIRA could compile annual transparency statistics to better compare apples to apples, to underscore when costs and benefits are not quantified, and to better distinguish between additive and subtractive rules and guidance. At bottom, the benefits sought via regulation are also forms of wealth, and they require market disciplines, not just political ones, to flourish. Markets and competitive enterprise make the world not just richer, but fairer, safer, and cleaner. Regulation doesn't get all the credit. Disagreements over regulatory benefits are the core concern that separate left and right today. These are irreconcilable, but that's actually constructive because it underscores that elected legislators must resolve controversial issues involving regulations with massive impact. But for lesser anxieties, my optimism rests in knowing that some among us agree that sometimes so-called market failures might be rooted in long-standing political failures, and that coercive top-down regulation isn't always the answer. On good days, both the left and right understand regulatory capture and rent-seeking. Until Article I comes to the rescue, here's hoping that today's invigorating savings and streamlining remain permanent changes to the regulatory and guidance landscape. When it comes to economic expansion, you don't have to tell the grass to grow, but you do need to move the rocks off of it. Why not use the new task forces as a lever? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you all for your insightful testimony this morning. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Katz, let me start with you. You implied that members are confused on some issues, so let me pick up on that. I am one of them that you confused in some of your statements there, particularly when you described, in your words, not mine, but that the manner in which regulations come forth is a hard process, a transparent process. From my perspective, it's neither of those. I've run into businesses that are totally unaware that regulations are being formulated. They just wake up one morning and find out there's more regs in their various industry, whatever it is, and they bypass Congress, and all of a sudden we have one legislative body, and that's not agencies. So what is the regulatory process by which they're created?
The Administrative Procedures Act covers most of the rulemaking process, and what I meant by transparency was, and this is the disadvantage to small businesses, is that there are a lot of points along the way in which businesses can offer their comment. Unfortunately, small businesses can't afford the legions of lawyers and lobbyists that big businesses do to keep track of all that's going on in the regulatory space. But there's, the Administrative Procedures Act and the, a variety of other acts and executive orders, do govern a very systematic process of rulemaking. And in some respects, it's too rigid, but it does exist.
I would like to have more information on that, because I see these regulations in essence become law. Businesses have to abide by them. It's law, and there's penalties if they don't. And these are laws that are not created by Congress, and yet they are happening without the jurisdiction and oversight of Congress. To me, that's very problematic. That's not the way our system is designed to operate. But let's move on from here. Let me, Mr. Cruz, let me hit you. In previous attempts from other administrations to retrospectively review regulations, oftentimes that actually resulted in more regulations. What makes this effort different?
You have to have an engaged president and engaged executive to do it. There were cuts under the Obama administration's retrospective review program, and I think that's important in this debate too, because I heard you mention James Gattuso at the Heritage Foundation. I heard him say that if the Obama administration's retrospective review program was a legal thing to do and an appropriate thing to do, this kind of approach is too. But when President Reagan came in and set up the initial central review process at OIRA, it already pre-existed because of the Paperwork Reduction Act. But that was when there was a focus put on doing cost-benefit analysis of regulations. But the problem is still so many of them are missed, and that's one of the reasons the cost can still go up like you're talking about, because if you're talking about a flow of over 3,500 rules that are going through every year, and then you've got a few hundred that OIRA reviews that are considered significant, then of that, there are some that are major or economically significant. And of those, you end up with just a sliver, a dozen or so, that have cost-benefit analysis at all. And there's a few extras that have cost analysis. So there's a lot that can slip through. And other forms of cost may come in the form of regulatory guidance and things of that sort, because you mentioned small business and business. You've certainly heard from them on regulatory guidance in recent years, too. But I think that's one of the reasons. It takes effort, and it takes setting goals. I think if you try to do regulatory reduction commissions, or if you try to put this kind of regulatory review model in statute, something like that, you've still got to put goals in place so that the regulators know that it's time to trim things. And this is not a partisan issue, too. I mean, when the Regulatory Improvement Commission was debated, I remember a report from the Progressive Policy Institute where they said these rules are stacking up. It's like pebbles in a stream. You drop a little pebble in the stream, and that's fine. But over time, it accumulates. And one of the things that we don't ever do is go through and try to say, well, how much of this makes sense anymore? As I said in my testimony, it's not just regulation that gets you health and safety benefits too. You've got to get those from other areas. You've got to have a lot of forces that array to expand health and safety as well as economic efficiency. So it's too easy for rules to slip through is the essence of it.
Okay, just a yes/no from you, Mr. Coley. The difference. Thank you for being involved in the UK and hear what you did. The differences in our government, will it impact the success of this effort here? The differences between the UK and the US?
The UK not having a separation of powers, the primary difference is around Congress, and the primary difference between the UK and the US is the UK requires regulatory impact analysis for acts by Parliament. The US does not require regulatory impact analysis for acts of Parliament, for acts of Congress.
So can this still work here is my question.
It could. That's definitely a limitation in the US model, but it's a difference.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
I thank the gentleman. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy, again for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If there's one thing my constituents care about, it's effective and efficient government. That is why it's concerning to me to see what the Trump administration is doing, for instance, in the area of health care. It appears that they are actively undermining programs to help my constituents afford quality health insurance. I'd like to ask whether there are legitimate reasons for some of the things that the Trump administration is doing or whether they're just playing politics. Mr. Goodwin, the Trump administration has indicated it will stop necessary cost-sharing subsidies that help Americans afford health insurance. This has required Congress and some of the lawmakers, especially in the Senate, to come up with an agreement to help save health insurance for millions of Americans. And even that plan is at risk of not being able to be passed by the House. Mr. Goodwin, is there a reason other than politics that would explain why the Trump administration is putting the health insurance of millions at risk?
Healthcare is a little outside my wheelhouse, policy-wise, expertise-wise, but I guess I can answer as an interested member of the public, somebody who reads the newspapers. And from my sort of outsider perspective, it does look like playing politics. And I mean, that still should be of grave concern because it really undermines public esteem for our governing institutions when something like healthcare policy, people's healthcare, is being used as a political, or is it being targeted through political games?
Mr. Goodwin, the Trump administration has also issued an emergency rule which would allow any employer to claim an exemption from providing women with birth control under the Affordable Care Act. Mr. Goodwin, is there a reason other than politics that would explain why the Trump administration is putting the health care of millions of women at risk?
Similar answers before. I can't think of a legitimate policy reason, but again, I'm outside of my substantive policy wheelhouse. To me, it looks like playing politics, and that's just as damaging to the institution of the presidency, I think.
And finally, Mr. Goodwin, the Trump administration has announced it will be taking down the healthcare.gov website for quote-unquote maintenance every Sunday morning through the end of the open enrollment period. These morning hours, as you know, are the ideal time for Americans, especially families, to shop for health insurance. And this plan will make it difficult for many Americans to shop for the right health insurance plan for them at times that are convenient for them. Mr. Goodwin, is there any reason other than politics that would explain why the Trump administration is actively sabotaging the efforts of American families to plan for their health care futures?
It doesn't look good, and it really would be great if the Trump administration explained the policy basis for that, because otherwise we're just left with the impression that this is just an ideological-driven action on their part.
Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. I'm disappointed to hear that it appears that the Trump administration is playing politics with the health care of millions of American families. I hope the administration considers doing better by them. Thank you very much.
The chair recognizes himself for a series of questions. Mr. Coley, let me come to you. Where did you see most of the cost reductions in your implementation in the UK?
Across the board, so I would say the largest areas were around occupational health and safety, around employment. We had a big area around, so they would be the two largest areas, I would say, off memory, though it's a little bit dated. But again, I just want to emphasize the way in which we did it. So you'd have an agency like our Food Standards Agency responsible for making sure that restaurants followed good food hygiene.
Right.
And they would regularly visit a restaurant establishment and find that the establishment didn't know what to do in order to comply with the law, and so was endangering the people who went to the premises. And so the approach was to give them much clearer guidance, which said, here are the 10 things you need to do. And often small businesses particularly found that extremely helpful in helping them work out what to do, and therefore it was possible for them to reduce costs whilst maintaining protections. That similar approach was used by a number of our agencies. Another thing that was a very important approach was looking at e-enablement. So we were in the relatively early days of the internet as we were starting this, and by taking processes away from complex paper forms and putting them on easy, intuitive, electronic processes, which are where you use design thinking to design the technique in a way that is intuitive for the user, can get rid of all of that time when you're trying to work out what you're meant to do and replace it with time when you're having a seamless transaction. So those kind of things were very, very powerful and were the bulk of the changes that the UK made.
Well, and since many members of Congress love to watch C-SPAN and watch the debating back and forth in a different style than what we're used to here, perhaps you can help me understand when you actually implemented that in the UK. the cost savings, how did that get redirected? Was it redirected somewhere else? Was it actually, I mean, how was it realized?
These are savings for business.
Right.
And we had a very high quality accounting system for a pound of savings. We had to demonstrate it was a genuine saving for business. We then had the numbers validated. We now have an independent committee which validates all those numbers called the Regulatory Policy Committee. And businesses would use that time for things that are different to complying with regulations. So let's take that small business restaurateur. The moment when they're not trying to work out what the rules are, they're using that to think about what should be on the menu next week. So it releases time back into the economy. But the one thing I would say is, we were able to get the support of both the trade union community and consumer groups because our emphasis was absolutely about maintaining protections. And our emphasis was not about, reducing air quality or reducing worker safety or anything like that. It was all about maintaining protections and looking for places where you could streamline the process. And indeed, one of your colleagues talked about how businesses sometimes find it hard to learn about new regulations. We had a review around small businesses and guidance, and somebody said to me, we had a small business person lead that review, and she said, have you ever bought an electronic device like a television? I said, yes. And she said, when you buy one, you get a quick start guide, which tells you what you need to do when you set up the TV. Yes, you get the 100-page manual, but you also get the quick start guide. And she said, where's your quick start guide for regulation? And that was an incredibly powerful insight, and one that allowed us to think about new ways to do that. So within a relatively short period, we were setting up quick start guides for every new regulation. Another thing we did in the UK is almost all regulations come into force on 2 days of the year. And so they either come into force in April or in October. And so while there may be a number coming into force, because they're all coming into force on the same day, it's easier for business to get used to it. Whereas if you have them coming in every month, these are very easy things to do that do not impact on protections but have real impact. But they're a long, long way from the sort of political dialogue. And the last thing I'd say is our approach was highly technocratic. It was about technically boring things that made a difference in the real world.
Well, thank you. So I'm running low on time. We'll have a second round where we'll be able to follow up with some of the rest of you. So let me finish very quickly, Mr. Coley. Would you say that this type of regulatory process, where we're actually reviewing and removing regulations, should be a long-term process or more of a spring cleaning kind of once-a-year event that we go in and review it?
Certainly the experience of other countries, the United Kingdom, Australia, Netherlands, etc., has been that introducing long-term disciplines is very, very important, in the same way that long-term disciplines around high-quality cost-benefit analysis, which a number of my colleagues talked about on the panel, is important. Always thinking about ways to maintain protections whilst streamlining is a good thing as well.
So long-term?
Yes.
All right. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from the District of Columbia, Ms. Eleanor Holmes Norton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Long before I came to Congress, I chaired the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission and had the experience of dealing with regulations and guidelines. And so I'll preface my question by indicating to you, in light of the high profile of sexual harassment in today's headlines, that the Commission studied what were then a few court decisions, district court decisions, indicating that sexual harassment was a violation of an anti-discrimination act. And it had not been so declared. When we did so, of course, we put the guidelines out for comment, but I did something that may be fairly unusual, and I wish we'd done more often today. Obviously, business did not want any kind of regulations of any kind, and I've never heard of a business testifying in favor of regulations. But I called in the leaders of the Business Roundtable and other such business groups and indicated what we had seen happen, that essentially It looked like courts were opening them to liability, and that the government agency had given them no indication of what in the world sexual harassment was. There's a broad statute, it didn't put sexual harassment in it, and so employers didn't even know what to tell their managers about how to handle this very delicate problem. So we got to call them in. And I said, I know you don't want to see any regulation, but if you do not even know what sexual harassment is, how can you be protected against sexual harassment? So you can talk about regulations all you want to, but I had a good conversation at that time with the business community and got their input personally about how they had handled sexual harassment. And I must tell you, some of what had hit the newspapers would make anyone bow their head. I give you that experience because I had to cope with what regulations, guidelines that had never been defined. And by the way, the Supreme Court went on to find that the guidelines were constitutional, and I believe the guidance has been helpful to business, as opposed to being left out there with nothing said. Now, therefore, it seems to me, when I went beyond notice and comment, but actually had the business leaders to come in and see me, I have valued transparency, and because we did accept many changes that could only come from them, that experience with chairing an administrative agency has led me to understand how important transparency is, instead of just being a word that everyone will always buy into. So I'm interested in these task forces. The public will be interested in these task forces. Do any of you know whether or not these task forces consist of career civil servants or, for example, appointees? Does anybody know that? Yes, Mr. Cruz.
In the panel this morning, the indication seemed to be that the majority a lot of the members were career employees. But other than that, I don't know. That's what I'd heard in prior reports as well, and I think that's probably true. But I thank you for the comments on guidelines. It's very, very interesting, the distinctions between regulations and guidances, and what role the regulators take and what role Congress takes.
Well, the guidelines were no different in the long run to regulations, because the Supreme Court, in defining what was sexual harassment, used the guidelines and said that what the agency had found was, in fact, the definition from here on in. And so you go to the Supreme Court today, you will find those guidelines used. But the importance of the guidelines, as far as I was concerned, is it told business what was a violation in the first place. So the transparency is very important, it seems to me, to all of us. And Mr. Goodwin, you've heard Mr. Cruz say that he thought that these were primarily career civil servants, and we understand career civil servants operate under the guidance of appointees, but it was reassuring to hear that he believes they were career civil servants, who then, of course, would have to convince the appointee. But what is your view of who should be on these task forces?
Well, I was encouraged, too, by the fact that there's so many career employees on that, on these task forces. The first question that sprung to mind for me today was, why am I just hearing about this for the first time today? I didn't know anything about these task forces, for the most part, the identity of the membership until today. So congratulations to this committee for extracting that information. But this is something I've been tracking for a long time, and I know a lot of people have. So it's a little disappointing that we're just now learning basic stuff about these task forces, which are evidently so important and having such a crucial, or making such a crucial contribution to the Trump administration's domestic policy agenda. So I would note that. And the other thing I would note is I hear so much about how the deep state at these agencies and how they're just sabotaging everything the Trump administration is doing. And then one by one, all these agency representatives said that, no, that's not the case at all. These people are professionals. They're given a task and they do it well. And I share the chairman in applauding them for that. I think that's great, and I think it reflects really well on the public servants in our agencies, and I hope we all learn something from that.
Well, do you think, for example, we ought to at least know the agenda of the task forces so as to know which kinds of regulations they are focusing on, so that we know, for example, whether they're focusing on outdated regulations? Of course, regulations have to be updated, or life-saving ones. Is there any agenda published so that the public would know which they're focusing on? Ms. Katz?
I can't say whether the agendas themselves are published. I can say, though, that if the task forces recommend to the agency that there be changes to particular rules, that the agency does have to open, you know, a docket, if you will, and take public comment on changing that regulation. In other words, you have to create a regulation to get up to end a regulation, and that's the process I was referring to earlier in terms of there being a formal process.
Well, there's already in place something from OMB for cost-benefit analysis. Mr. Goodwin, are there difficulties in doing a cost-benefit analysis that everybody could agree upon as objective?
Well, I think what we're learning from the cost-benefit analyses on these rules that are being rolled back under the Trump administration is that any sort of claim to credibility or objectivity that cost-benefit analysis may have had has been thrown out the window with these cost-benefit analyses.
Is there an objective way to do cost-benefit analysis?
I mean, there is, unless you are trying to support a decision made by other means, and I think that's what we're seeing with these cost-benefit analyses. If they were to do an honest cost-benefit analysis for these regulatory rollbacks, frankly, the rollbacks would look terrible as an economic matter. And that's why, for example, at the EPA, the Trump administration and Administrator Pruitt put out these really fuzzy cost-benefit analyses where, you know, problematic data, assumptions, accounting tricks, kind of iffy accounting tricks were used to justify these decisions that under any reasonable application of cost-benefit analysis would not pass a cost-benefit analysis test.
Mr. Chairman, if I may ask a final question here. I'm really only looking for, Ms. Katz testified that, you know, at such point as I suppose you were saying, Ms. Katz, that the task forces had a change that they wanted the agency to make. At that point, there would be some transparency. Was that your testimony?
The task forces only make recommendations to the agency. They don't carry out.
Well, see, that's important. So how are they to make recommendations without being identified so that they could receive some input from the public?
I do believe they get some input from the public.
But we don't even know who they are. How do they, you know, at the regulatory stage, you have to have input from the public, but then you're making a recommendation to, let's say, the head of the agency, but you've had no input from the public at that point, though you are making a recommendation for changes in the regulations.
Yes, and these are experts who are making these recommendations, but I suppose it's up to every agency how much input they want to get on their internal recommendations. But as soon as there's any, you know, action involved, then public input is immediate.
Mr. Cruz, did you want to say something on that?
Just a quick thing. I think it's important to point out that I think the agencies of their own accord could have undertaken these kinds of task forces on their own. It didn't have to come from a presidential executive
I think that's an important point.
Right, and so we have to agree that a president, because remember, these are executive agencies, not the independent agencies. We have to agree that the president has some authority in setting his own regulatory agenda.
He certainly does, and he wants as much information as he can get.
Yeah, but Diane's right. It could have been done without an executive order, so that's one thing. So you would know it's going to be internal people within.
Well, we're not questioning the legality of the task forces.
Some, there, a lot of the questions seem to be, I think.
Well, I think you can rely on, whoever you want to on your staff. It's the transparency question for me. The notion that
it comes out in the notice and comment. That's, I think,
but these people have already made a recommendation. Look, as when I chaired the EOC, I didn't. I was dependent upon staff.
Right.
The earlier I had some notion of whether business would think this is the worst thing in the world, the better off I was. And I'm asking whether or not early consultation with the public would be facilitated if the task forces asked for some information from the public or from experts, and if we knew who they were, instead of making them look like they're part of some kind of deep state that nobody knows anything about ever, because we don't know anything, we don't even know what they do until the agency head.
I hear what you're saying. I think that's where things are headed. I think that's the trajectory. You might remember a couple of weeks ago now, there was a day of, it was October 2nd, Vice President Pence gave a speech at the White House, and then after that there were breakout sessions across the various agencies. I went to one of them, and what the key point is that they are looking for comment from the public. And it's
the task forces.
It wasn't the task forces. This was the breakout sessions from the agencies, which you would imagine would have to include and be a part of the task forces, because a lot of the theme of all of this was the executive orders and taking another look at regulation. So part of that ethos was getting input from the public. So I think that's where it's all headed. And ultimately, whatever is put together in the docket would have to go through public notice and comment anyway, because you can't get rid of a regulation, you can only replace it.
Finally, I understand that, but I think
the chair is going to give a generous 8 minutes here, so go ahead, your final question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You're a good friend, but you do understand I'm holding up the fort by myself on this side of the table,
and using everyone's time that's not here. But go
right.
ahead, last question.
And they have ceded to me, if that helps. Yeah, and I appreciate your generosity. What I'm really saying is that, and I'm going from my own experience, I didn't have a sense of how I knew business was on the spot, because there could be liability if, in fact, they were sued. I knew they didn't like regulations, so I had my own staff, even before I called them, to consult with business so that I would not, in fact, in the first instance, be issuing guidelines that would send them up the wall. What I value so much, Mr. Chairman, is that you have opened up for us the notion of these task forces that we knew nothing about. And Mr. Cruz, I appreciate what you said, because I hope the chairman heard what Mr. Cruz said, that he felt we were headed toward more input for the task forces themselves from the public, so that by the time they got to the agency level, their own recommendations would have more credibility, because somehow or the other the public had been business, to be sure, and the public had been asked their advice, maybe not on any final regulation, but at least on what the task force was undertaking. So I appreciate, Mr. Cruz, your notion that you think they were headed in that direction. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentlewoman. The chair recognizes himself for a series of questions. Ms. Katz, I want to come back to you, because you've made it very clear that this is an open and transparent process when it comes to actually, I think you said you need to set up a regulation to do away with a regulation. I think what you meant is you need to set up a rule to do away with a regulation, which requires the same comment period as we do that. And you're in my wheelhouse now. This is what I live for. And so at this point, if we're actually going to do away with the rules and regulations and guidance, is there not a noticing period that's required under federal statute anytime that we're going to have to adjust that? Is there something that's required?
For most rules, there would be.
What about guidance?
I'm sorry?
What about guidance?
Well, guidance, Yeah, I may need your help on this. I don't know if guidance has to go through a rulemaking procedure.
All right, so now you're really hitting in my area because the gentlewoman made a good point. Is many times guidance is viewed just as strongly as rules and regulations. In fact, we've found that a lot of times administrations get around the rulemaking process by offering guidance that carries essentially the enforcement of law, but maybe not the enforcement of law, depending on how it gets litigated. So do you see a problem?
Mr. Chairman, if I could just use a second of your time to say
Well, you've used a second of everybody else's time, so why not? Go ahead.
That the guidelines I speak of did not have to go through the rulemaking process, and I deliberately put them through the rulemaking process.
Kudos to you. Ms. Katz.
Some guidance are reviewed by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, but
OIRA.
There are some that don't, and I think the exchange with Mr. Heisen and I, what I had meant when I referred to transparency and openness was proper rulemaking. So I just want to correct that. But that being said, the other real loophole here is on independent agencies. And this is particularly problematic because since it's 2010 and Dodd-Frank, hundreds, if not thousands, of very costly and burdensome regulations have come through these independent agencies. They're the ones who are getting a free pass here, and that's another problem.
And so your premise is that they should not get a free pass.
They should not get a free pass.
Okay. Mr. Cruz, would you agree with that?
I would agree they should not get a free pass. The independent agencies are heavy, heavy regulators, and it had been the case that economic regulation in the U.S. was declining and environmental regulation was rising, but in recent years, after Dodd-Frank and in the healthcare legislation and now net neutrality legislation and regulation and things of that sort, economic regulation is trickling up, but the agencies can issue guidance rather than issue rules. Another piece of guidance that was a huge guidance was the Waters of the United States rule. That had actually started out as guidance, and like you, they went through and did notice and comment on that. Yeah. But there are many, many economically significant pieces of guidance, but there are thousands of secondary guidances out there that kind of slip through the cracks, and they go through their guidance, memoranda, notices, circulars, bulletins, administrative interpretations. It's a whole word salad of these, and they're not taken into account in the notice and comment process, and they really can, the agencies can really slip aside and use guidances instead. So it's something you have to watch as you do a 2-for-1 or any kind of reg reform campaign.
So, Mr. Goodwin, would you agree with Ms. Katz and Mr. Cruz that they should be included in the review process?
What? In centralized? No, absolutely not.
Why is that? Because you're all about transparency, and all of a sudden now you're disagreeing with your two colleagues on the left and right.
Well, I reject the premise that OIRA is transparent to begin with.
So you think OIRA should be done away with?
Yeah, absolutely. And
why is that? Because
it adds nothing of value to the rulemaking process.
And what quantitative analysis would you suggest that it adds nothing?
I mean,
what studies, what quantitative analysis would you've been here, and I get a little frustrated, Mr. Goodwin, because you act like you don't know what's going on. You're an expert witness. You act like all of this is new information, and actually there's been online portals with the task force and so forth, and you're opining on what is and what is not accurate. So what quantitative analysis do you have to support that OIRA should be done away with?
I don't know if quantitative analysis is necessary.
So you just have your opinion?
No. I have several examples of rules that were weakened as a result of the rulemaking process.
And which ones would those be?
The EPA's coal ash rule.
So would you agree with WOTUS's rulemaking guidance to rulemaking analysis with regards to how OIRA was involved in that? Do you agree with that? You're an EPA lawyer, right? So you probably are well informed on that.
I'm not sure what you're asking me about. There was a WOTUS guidance, which Mr. Cruz was talking about, which did undergo OIRA review. There was the original WOTUS rule, which underwent 2 OIRA reviews.
Right.
And now there's
So where did they go wrong on that?
On the WOTUS rule itself?
Yeah.
It could have been stronger, I think.
Okay, so let me go back to something. You've been talking about how the budgetary analysis that the Trump administration has done is bogus. You didn't use the word bogus, but you questioned its validity under the Trump administration on some of this rulemaking rollback. Is that correct?
You mean the cost-benefit analysis?
Yes. All right. And so which cost-benefit analysis are you referring to?
The two that I have in mind is the Waters of the U.S. repeal and the Clean Power.
So what quantitative analysis do you now you're in my wheelhouse again, and if I know you're a moot quarter, and so if you want to debate it back and forth, I'll be glad to debate this. So in what quantitative analysis would you suggest that was wrong? Are you an economist?
No.
Are you do you have a degree in statistics?
No, I have a master's in public policy. And
okay, what about comparative analysis?
To the extent that that's incorporated.
So, Mr. Goodwin, you're an expert witness here, and you're making statements, sworn testimony. I guess based on what analysis are you suggesting that those were quantitatively incorrect?
Well, I mean, my own assessment of them, as well as the assessment of other experts on them, including folks at NRDC, the Resources for the Future, all kinds of folks who have looked at these things. And we all agree that these, and a researcher at a PhD economist at Harvard.
You're giving credentials, you're not giving quantitative analysis. What quantitative analysis
for example,
would you suggest to support your testimony here?
For example, with the Waters of the United States rule, the repeal by the Trump administration, they took the one large category of benefits that they could find, the protection of wetlands, and they just zeroed it out based on some pretty flimsy.
Pretty flimsy according to you?
No, according to everybody who's looked at it.
Everybody? Well, not according to me. I can tell you I'm not in the everybody. Ms. Katz, were you part of that? Did you think it was bogus? Okay.
Okay,
so
everybody.
Mr. Goodwin, my point is, when you make statements, you need to back them up with proof. And so let's go under the previous administration. Were there any of their analysis, cost-benefit analysis, that was incorrect?
Yeah.
On which ones?
Off the top of my head, the coal ash rule that I just mentioned before.
So you're saying that they made the wrong analysis on implementing coal ash? That may make headlines.
The cost-benefit analysis, yeah.
So you said it would actually benefit us a lot more? Is that what you're saying? I'm trying to figure out where you're coming from on this.
It's been a while since I looked at it, but the rule itself was stronger than during the OIRA process. It was weakened, and part of the process for weakening it was, or part of the justification for weakening it was a cost-benefit analysis that was flawed, yes.
Okay. So can you get to this committee, your analysis on where the Trump administration has gone wrong on the cost-benefit analysis?
Sure.
Your personal.
Oh, yeah, sure, and it's cited in my, testimony as well.
So you're saying today is the first day that you really understood anything about the makeup or the input from these task force. Today is the first day. That's your sworn testimony.
I know very little about what was in these things beyond, I think a New York Times report was all I ever really saw of.
But I thought you were the expert witness here today.
How can I be an expert on something that's not transparent?
Well, but it is. I would say that I had my staff look up. I said, certainly this has to be transparent. And there's actually online portals at DOD, Commerce, Interior, and other agencies already. And you're the expert, and yet you don't know about those online portals and the request for information?
Oh, I saw the Department of Interior one. All it did was.
But I thought today was your first day that you found out about it.
No. I said the membership.
That was your sworn testimony.
No, I said that today was the first day I knew about the membership of the task forces and who those individuals were.
So are the task forces a good thing or a bad thing?
No, they're a bad thing.
And you base that on
I
what?
identify 4 flaws in my testimony.
In terms of, so it's a bad thing based on. Well, I thought, according to you, I got a quote from you that basically said that you didn't think that this deregulation executive order was really amounted to anything. Because according to you, it was like a bumper sticker or a stump speech, something that is hard to be translated into regulatory policy, but we're hearing today it's actually been translated into regulatory policy, and it's actually saved millions of dollars. So would you revise that statement?
Well, $22 million, which according to my calculations is 7 cents per American.
So what you're saying is because it's only $22 million, that's not a big deal?
No, I'm just saying it's not as there's you know, to the extent that so what we heard today from the first
is $22 million a big deal?
It's not as big a deal as people are making it out to be. And here's the important thing.
Here's the important thing. No, that's not an important thing. I think at this particular point, you know, what I'm seeing is we've asked a host of people to come here from an expert witness standpoint. What I got from you was disappointing, Mr. Goodwin, because what it came in was with more rhetoric on what you thought with perhaps an agenda. Actually, since you mentioned the Times article, they just passed me a note. The Times article that you referred to actually included many of the names of the task force members, so maybe you didn't read it.
No, I did. That's what I said. Is to the extent that I knew anything about the membership, it was from that article.
Okay. Here's what I want the message to go away with. I want to thank each one of you for your testimony. Mr. Coley, thank you for giving us a good model of which actually we saw it implemented in the UK and how it's making a difference. Mr. Goodwin, you know, I come back to you and say that perhaps we can look at this in a more open way from a cost-benefit analysis, and I'll be glad to work with you in the future looking at it from a different perspective. Ms. Katz, Mr. Cruz, thank you so much for your expert testimony in terms of what it's doing. Mr. Goodwin, I would disagree with you from a standpoint of the value of OIRA. Under the previous administration and under this administration, I think they perform a critical role. And to suggest otherwise really makes me question really your testimony from an administrative procedures point of view. I mean, again, you're in my wheelhouse, and I'll be glad to follow up. If you want to come by my office, my door is always open. Be glad to do that. But here's the concern I have. This is saving real dollars for the American people. And you may not think $22 million is a lot, but I think it's a whole lot. And every dollar, whether it's 7 cents or not, is money that can be directed towards other things. And it's critically important. And I think what we ought to do is applaud these task force and the efforts that's there. It shouldn't be a spring cleaning kind of event, Mr. Coley. It should be an ongoing event. And as we look at that, to try to implement this across the board. If there is no further business before the subcommittees stand adjourned.
KJ. Let me know when you're ready for whites, KJ. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hello, KJ. You did not respond to my text messages, KJ. I'm upset at you because I text you pictures of my compressor and you did not respond to me. That was rude. Very rude. I'm mad at KJ. Because we're in PCR 5, that's why. That's why. It's on the table over here. Stand by for training. See you tomorrow. Can he do whites on 2? Me? I'm ready. Hey, Kip, can you aim 1 to me? Aim 1 to you? Yes, please. No, Brandon, no, Brandon. Can you sit at witness table, please? Can you sit at the witness table? If you're gonna sit. Like, I tried to catch you. Yeah.
Thank you, Brandon, for your help. Oh, is that camera high enough? You can drop it, Bridget. Look, what are you gonna have?
You know, sometimes Mic check, Darren. Darren. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Hello, check 1, 2, 3, 4. Check, check 1, 2. 3, 4, 5. Check 1, 2, 3, 4 from 2154.
to